August 10, 1945. The world was already weary from a global war that had claimed tens of millions of lives. But this week, a new, terrifying sound echoed across the Pacific. The sound of a single plane carrying a weapon so devastating it instantly vaporized 20,000 people. I'm talking about the atomic bomb. You think you know the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but what you haven't realized is that the sheer scale of this destruction didn't just end a war. It fundamentally broke and remade the entire nature of human power, war, and diplomacy forever. This is the week the world entered uncharted waters, a week where the threat of a flash became the supreme authority, and the full horror of a single bomb was only just beginning to sink in. Stay with me to understand how two explosions changed everything, down to the final desperate arguments inside Emperor Hirohito's bunker. This week, American planes dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Last week, the materials for that bomb were delivered to Tinian in the Marianas. Just before the ship delivering them, the USS Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese torpedo. President Harry Truman made the decision to use the bomb after the Japanese failed to respond to the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. In 1945, the B-29 plane Enola Gay dropped the Little Boy atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The plane, named after pilot Paul Tibbets' mother, was part of the 509th Composite Air Group. The bomb's yield was nearly 20,000 tons of TNT. 60% of the city was destroyed, and 80,000 people were killed, many of them instant. While the firebombing of Tokyo in March was more destructive overall, the fact that a single plane could cause this devastation showed only too well the complete change in military and political thinking which has begun, as Donald Somerville noted. Tens of thousands more were injured. Of 90,000 buildings, 62,000 were destroyed. Of 200 doctors, 180 were killed or badly wounded. Only 3 of 55 hospitals remained usable. The scale of human destruction at Hiroshima was eventually to alter how mankind viewed war, power, and diplomacy. Let's backtrack a moment to the mission. On the night of August 5th, one single bomber set off for Hiroshima with escorts, part of Operation Centerboard. The Enola Gay took off from Tinian, carrying the uranium-235 core bomb. When the bomb was dropped at 8:15 a.m., it exploded 570 meters above the ground with a core temperature of around 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. Among the messages scrawled on the bomb was, "Greeting to the Emperor from the men of the Indianapolis." Survivors near the blast shared similar descriptions. First, a brief, tremendous flash of blue-white light, like a giant magnesium flare, followed by intense heat. Then came a huge pressure wave and the rumbling sound of the explosion, heard over 20 kilometers away. Finally, a gigantic white cloud shot up into the sky. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey reported that the energy was given off in the form of light, heat, radiation, and pressure. The light and radiant heat traveled in a straight line, meaning that any opaque object, even a single leaf, shielded what lay behind it. The flash lasted only a fraction of a second, but it caused third-degree burns to exposed skin up to a mile away, and clothing ignited. The heat generated temperatures in excess of 1,800 degrees Celsius, charring corpses beyond recognition near ground zero. As for the radiation, penetrating rays exposed X-ray films stored almost a mile from ground zero. Symptoms on human beings who survived the initial blast were generally delayed for 2 or 3 days. The process of blood formation was affected, and the body's ability to resist infection was destroyed. Death generally followed shortly thereafter. The short and long-term damage caused by these bombs to countless people would be catastrophic. Yes, bombs, plural. On the 9th, the bomber Boxcar dropped the Fat Man atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This mission, originally planned for the 11th, was moved forward 2 days due to predicted bad weather. Nagasaki wasn't the primary target, it was Kokura, but heavy industrial haze there forced pilot Charles Sweeney to divert to the secondary target. Though Fat Man was a more advanced bomb, it was less devastating than Hiroshima's due to Nagasaki's topography. It killed around 40,000 people. The bombers for both attacks belonged to the highly secretive 509th Composite composite group, whose sole mission was the atomic strike. Their compound on Tinian was so secure that even their technical commander was once turned away at gunpoint. Their B-29s were stripped of most armaments, relying on speed and altitude to evade interception. After dropping the device, the pilot had 40 seconds to execute a hard-banking, steep dive to fly at least 8 miles away from the detonation point. As the second bomb detonated, the Japanese Supreme War Council was meeting in Tokyo to discuss the Potsdam Declaration. They knew of the Hiroshima bombing by the 7th, but some doubted it was atomic or believed the Americans only possessed 1 or 2. Japan's leading nuclear scientist flew to Hiroshima and immediately confirmed the devastation could only be atomic. Japanese PM Suzuki tried to summon the council on the 8th, but was unable to reach a quorum. They finally met on the 9th, where the council was evenly divided. 3 members were for accepting unconditional surrender, and 3 were for continuing the war. War Minister Korochika Anami was adamant, arguing that Japan would inflict serious losses on the enemy and could reverse the situation, adding that the army would not submit to demobilization. With the council at an impasse, Foreign Minister Togo and Prime Minister Suzuki secretly convinced Emperor Hirohito to call another meeting over which he would preside. Just after midnight on the 10th, in his underground bomb shelter, the emperor read the Potsdam Declaration. After 2 hours of arguments, Hirohito intervened, which was highly unusual, stating, "Continuing the war can only result in the annihilation of the Japanese people and a prolongation of the suffering of all humanity. It seems obvious that the nation is no longer able to wage war." He instructed the council to bear the unbearable, and a formal acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration was sent to the Allies on the 10th. The acceptance came with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand that prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. President Truman and his advisors debated whether this condition negated the unconditional surrender. Secretary of State James Burns devised a reply stating that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. Truman ordered the suspension of atomic bombings, though conventional bombing continued. The world waited to see if Japan would accept. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union entered the war. On the 8th, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov informed the Japanese ambassador that since Japan had rejected the Potsdam demand, the Soviet proposal to mediate had lost all basis. The Allies had asked the Soviets to join the war to shorten it, and the Soviet government declared itself to be at war with Japan starting August 9th. The Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria and Korea, though 1.2 million strong, was a mere shell, stripped of its best divisions and lacking modern weapons. The 3 Soviet fronts, under Alexander Vasilevsky, attacked with 5,500 tanks and 3,900 planes. Despite facing the vast territory of Manchuria and incessant rain, the Soviets advanced everywhere, achieving strategic surprise. The Japanese Supreme Council received news of the second atomic bomb by the 9th, before any detailed reports of the Soviet advances. Due to the sudden Soviet invasion, U.S. strategists quickly agreed to the limits of occupation in Korea. Dean Rusk, a staff officer at U.S. Strategy and Planning, agreed with the Red Army that the 38th parallel should be the demarcation line, not anticipating any need to control movement between the 2 zones. This militarily indefensible line would of course become very important one day. In Burma, the Battle of the Sitang Bend concluded on the 7th, one of the largest Allied land victories over the Japanese. The next plan for that theater was Operation Zipper, to retake ports in Malaya as a staging ground for retaking Singapore. However, the size of the operation was affected by London's decision to release long-serving soldiers, stripping forces from the command of Louis Mountbatten, who also had his resources subordinated to the planned invasion of Kyushu, Operation Olympic. To end the week, on the 7th, the Japanese tested their first turbojet-powered aircraft, the Nakajima Kikka, which flew a single 20-minute flight. On the 8th in London, Britain, France, the US, and the USSR signed an agreement establishing a military tribunal for the trials of those who committed crimes against humanity. So the week ends with a massive Soviet invasion, fighting winding down in Burma, and 2 atomic bombs exploding over Japan. The Japanese have offered conditional surrender, and the Americans are working to resolve the sticking point regarding the emperor. Let's get back to that. In a flash, 80,000 people die. In a flash, 40,000 more die. How many more flashes will there be?
Or will the threat of a flash be enough to ensure a new kind of supremacy? What if someone else develops these flashes? Will there be a stalemate? Just as this global war that took tens of millions of lives is nearing its end, these two flashes herald the possibility of an even greater death toll. Make no mistake, from this week we are now in uncharted waters.